I poured another glass of wine. My hand didn't shake. The scent of alcohol mixed with the fragrance of white lilies is intense and cold. The saxophone began playing Blue and Green, slow and out of place amid the luxury. And with every pair of eyes watching, I whispered to myself, "All right, Elena, the game begins now." I never thought that at 58, I'd hear my own husband announce he wanted a divorce right in the middle of our 30th wedding anniversary, in front of more than 100 friends, colleagues, and relatives. People often say that when you've lived long enough, you learn to accept anything with calm grace. But I realized no woman could possibly stay calm when the man who once swore to hold her hand for life uses a microphone to declare the end as if it were a quarterly report. The ballroom at the Drake that night blazed under the crystal chandeliers. The sound of wine being poured, of laughter, of soft jazz, mingled in a festive haze. I still remember the faint scent of vanilla candles, the pearl-colored satin dress that hugged my body, and the shade Victor once said made him feel at peace. Everything had been arranged to perfection except his words. 30 years, Victor said into the microphone, his voice smooth but icy. 30 years is enough, Elena, I think. I need a new beginning. With someone younger. Some guests laughed, thinking it was the prelude to a sentimental toast, but as he went on, every smile in the room vanished. I'll send you the divorce papers this week, and I want you out of the apartment on Lakeshore Drive by tomorrow. I want everything to be clear. I heard the shatter of a champagne flute. A woman gasped. His mother, Beatrice Langford, sat at the front table, calmly sipping her drink, the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. Her eyes seemed to say, "At last, my son is free from this burden." I didn't stand up right away. I just looked at the man who once promised to protect me from everything. It's almost funny how grand promises die quietly in the most glittering places. I raised my glass, took a sip, and when I set it down, my hand was steady. I stood, walked toward him, the chandelier lights reflecting off my face as serene as a winter lake. "Thank you, Victor," I said, my voice low, calm, and firm. "After 30 years, you're finally being honest. But don't worry. When it's my turn with the microphone, I'll talk about the truth, not yours, but ours." The room fell into thick silence. He faltered. A few guests coughed softly. I placed the microphone on the table and returned to my seat, a faint smile on my lips. Some people looked at me with pity, others with curiosity, but I didn't need anyone's pity. I only needed time, just a little, so they could realize that the woman they thought was the victim was actually the one holding the keys to the game. Victor stepped down from the stage, still trying to maintain composure, but his hand trembled. I noticed it. After 30 years together, I knew every flicker of his body, and I knew this wasn't an impulsive moment. This was a performance carefully planned from his words, to the guest list to the lighting. The goal: to humiliate me publicly, then force me to sign the divorce papers amicably. But he forgot I was never meant to play the supporting role. I caught Beatrice's eyes, fixed on the gaze of a Victor. She was the puppeteer behind it all, from Victor's finances to every detail of the evening. I once overheard her tell a friend over tea, "Elena is kind, but a woman who can't give a man a child can't keep him." I stayed silent then, but tonight I wouldn't. I lifted my glass, slowly swirling it until the light scattered into golden streaks across the table. Inside me, everything grew sharp, defined. The late-night calls he claimed were meetings, the times he turned off his screen as I entered the room, the expensive perfume that wasn't mine, and Beatrice's visit asking, "Where do you keep the apartment papers, just in case?" Now it all made sense. They wanted to erase me legally, publicly, and disgracefully. But what they didn't know was that I already knew. And I was ready. I glanced around the room where our marriage had once been toasted. Our marriage now sat frozen, unsure of what to do. They saw me upright, composed, and perhaps they thought I was breaking inside. I wasn't. In that instant, it felt as if a fog lifted from my mind. I was no longer afraid, no longer ashamed. I was clearer than ever. Victor kept smiling, trying to make small talk to rescue the mood. But no one was listening anymore. I heard Beatrice order more wine, the musician awkwardly changing songs. And within that tune, I looked at the man who ended 30 years with 4 tidy sentences and thought, he believes tonight belongs to him. But it doesn't. It belongs to me. I took another sip of wine, feeling the warmth slide down my throat. I lifted my head and smiled at my reflection in the grand mirror on the wall. That face no longer belonged to the fragile woman who had endured in silence. It was the face of someone who had just awakened. Beside me, my clutch sat neatly on the table. Inside was the folder I'd spent weeks preparing. Documents, evidence, and an unsent letter. I had always known this day would come. I just never imagined it would arrive dressed in so much glitter. As the saxophone lingered into its final note, I poured myself another drink. My hands still didn't shake. The scent of alcohol mingled with lilies, rich and cold. I looked around the room, once filled with memories of a shared life, now only a stage. And under all those watching eyes, I whispered enough for only me to hear, "All right, Elena, the game begins now. Do you believe a person can change their whole life in just one night? Stay with me, because tonight is the night I begin again in a way no one could ever expect." I still remember the first time I met Victor one autumn afternoon at Northwestern University. He was a senior in business administration, and I was a sophomore studying accounting. Back then he was tall, confident, and so charming that he made me, a quiet, introspective girl, laugh within 5 minutes of talking. He said I was smart, practical, the kind of woman who would build a solid home. That sentence planted in me a belief that he saw my inner worth, not just my appearance. I was wrong. We married 2 years after graduation. A small, simple, warm wedding. My parents gave us a little apartment on Lakeshore Drive, the same one he would later try to take from me. I still remember the day we moved in. He said, "From now on, everything is ours." I believed him. I didn't know that when a man says ours but only means mine, a woman's life becomes an endless negotiation. The first years of marriage were truly happy. I worked as an accountant for a construction company, and he began to rise in a major logistics firm. At night, we cooked together, listened to music, and talked about our future. The small apartment overlooking Lake Michigan was filled with laughter, and I once believed that was where I would grow old beside him. But after 3 childless years, everything began to change. The doctor said we were both healthy. No reason we couldn't have children. Nature just hasn't chosen the time yet. But to Beatrice, Victor's mother, there was nothing natural about it. She called it a deficiency. I remember the first evening she came for dinner, glancing around and saying, half joking, "Beautiful house, spacious, but too quiet. A child would make it warmer." I smiled politely. But after that, remarks like that came every time she visited, like a cold needle pricking the same wound. Victor began to change after those whispers. He came home less, always claiming urgent projects. When I asked, he snapped, "Stop treating me like a child." That sentence silenced me, because I didn't want to be the nagging wife. I thought if I stayed patient, everything would be fine. But patience can be the trap that keeps you locked inside your own suffering. I still tried to fill our home with life. I bought flowers, changed curtains, remodeled the kitchen, and planted herbs on the balcony. Every morning I made coffee, leaving his cup ready even though he rarely drank it. Every night I cooked dinner and waited, though nights when he came home early had become rare. And every time I heard the elevator stop on our floor, my heart lifted with hope like a child still believing in miracles. But miracles never came. In our 10th year of marriage, Victor was promoted to branch director. I was proud even though it meant he'd be home even less. He started caring about his looks, going to the gym, replacing his entire wardrobe, and buying expensive colognes I'd never heard of. When I teased, "New style?" he laughed. A leader needs to look the part. I didn't think much of it until one day I found a receipt for a gift from Tiffany's, even though my birthday was still 2 months away. I didn't confront him. I just folded the receipt and tucked it away. Maybe deep down I still wanted to believe he wouldn't betray me. Or maybe I was simply afraid of the truth. In the following years, I lived like a shadow. Cold breakfasts, brief phone calls, nights of late returns. We still appeared together at parties, still smiled, still held hands, but no one heard the silence in my eyes. Only I knew that in every touch, the warmth had long disappeared. And then there was Beatrice. She still came often, with her polite smile and soft, loaded voice. "Elena, you should prepare for the future. If, heaven forbid, something happens to Victor, this apartment, who would you leave it to? Family should know how to help you arrange things." I smiled and said lightly, "I haven't thought about that." But inside, I knew. She didn't care about me, only about the property tied to the Langford name. When Victor turned 50, I realized he no longer looked at me the same way. Whenever I talked about work or small things from my day, he merely nodded, distracted. I once read that in a dying marriage, people don't need to argue, they just need silence. And our apartment on Lakeshore Drive, despite all its light, had grown terrifyingly silent. I began keeping notes not out of suspicion, but to remember how I had once lived. In that little notebook I wrote, March 12, he didn't come home for dinner. Called, said he had a meeting. Came home at 11, unfamiliar perfume. April 5, Beatrice called, asked about the apartment documents. I said I wasn't sure. She said she'd come help me sort them out. April 20, Victor bought new shirts, French collars, and double cuffs, not his usual style. Said a colleague gifted them. I don't know when love turned into habit and habit turned into endurance. Then one October evening, while I was setting the table, Victor placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "I want to do something special for our 30th anniversary, a big celebration." I smiled, thinking it was the last spark of warmth. I had no idea it would be the stage he built to end me. I remember as he spoke, snow began to fall outside. The lights reflected on Lake Michigan like 1,000 broken mirrors. Looking back now, maybe the universe was warning me that sometimes the most beautiful things are just preludes to collapse. But that night, I still believed. I even planned to write a short speech to thank him for 30 years together. I drafted a few lines, written in purple ink on scented paper. If there's one thing I've learned in marriage, it's patience. And today, I know that the most beautiful thing isn't being together forever, but still looking at each other with gratitude. I didn't know that very gratitude would make me the perfect target for betrayal. Now, looking back, I don't regret loving him. I only regret taking so long to realize that love cannot survive alone. I loved, I tried, I endured. And that anniversary night, the one he thought was his triumph, was actually the moment he helped me see myself clearly. Because to begin again, sometimes you need a fall deep enough. That was the beginning of everything, and the reason I didn't crumble when he declared the end, because I knew the real ending hadn't even begun. I used to think betrayal always began with a kiss or a lie, but in truth it begins with silence. A strange kind of silence, not meant to avoid arguments, but to hide something growing in the dark. With Victor, it began that way. The first night I heard it was at 3 a.m. The phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. I turned over and saw Victor lift it, covering his mouth as he whispered. His voice dropped low, as if trying to keep me from hearing. I kept my eyes closed, pretending to sleep, but every word he spoke sliced through the cold air like a blade. "Don't worry, she doesn't suspect anything." I didn't open my eyes. I only heard him walk out of the room and close the door quietly. I lay there, feeling my heartbeat so loud I could almost hear it echo. She doesn't suspect anything. Just one short sentence, but enough to keep me awake all night. The next morning, Victor acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed my forehead, the scent of an unfamiliar cologne lingering on one I had never chosen for him. He said, "I've got an early meeting." I watched him tie his tie, the familiar motion, but his hand trembled slightly. I said nothing. I only smiled, poured coffee, and in my mind, a tiny fragment of trust began to crack. In the days that followed, small signs began to appear, quiet but unmistakable. A calendar reminder on his phone, labeled, "Call AB." 11. And when I asked, he said it was Alex Brown, a new colleague from Seattle. But when I offered to invite Alex over for dinner, he laughed lightly. "He's busy, don't bother him." That answer was enough for me to know Alex didn't exist. One morning, Beatrice stopped by the apartment unannounced. She always came under the pretense of visiting her son, but every visit ended with comments that left a chill in the air. This time, she sat on the sofa, stroking her teacup, and asked in her sweet but calculated tone, "Elena, you still have the deed to the apartment, don't you? I just want to check a few details, in case Victor needs to update the insurance." I smiled faintly and replied, "I remember my parents gifted us this apartment before the wedding, so all the documents are in the safe." A flicker of irritation crossed her eyes. I saw it, and I knew she wasn't asking out of curiosity. That night, Victor came home late. He said he'd had dinner with clients, but his tie was different from the one he wore that morning. His shirt was no longer crisp. When I asked, he smiled. "I spilled wine. Had to change at the office." I looked at him, said nothing. Sometimes silence is the best mirror that forces a liar to see themselves. A week later, I met Candice, my closest friend from college. We met at a cafe on Wabash. Candice was blunt and terrible at pretending. As soon as she sat down, she grabbed my hand, hesitating. "Elena, I don't know if I should say this, but yesterday I saw Victor on Oak Street. He was buying a ring at Tiffany's with a platinum blonde woman." I forced a smile. "Maybe a client." Candice looked at me for a long moment, her eyes filled with both anger and pity. "If she's a client, why did he touch her back like that?" That question followed me the entire drive home. On the highway, the city lights blurred across the windshield, hazy as fading memories. I didn't cry. I just felt something inside me shift slowly, cold and heavy. That night, Victor came home late again. While he was in the shower, I sat in the living room and opened his laptop. I'm not the kind of person who invades privacy, but when betrayal seeps into your bones, morality becomes a blurred line. His password was June 16, our wedding date. Ironic. Within minutes, everything unfolded. Fake meeting schedules, emails between him and Mercer Shaw attorney at law, subject line, property agreement draft. The attached file is named Waiver 900 Newtons Lake Shore. My chest tightened. That was our apartment address. At the bottom was another email from A. Bloom at subject. "She has no idea. It's going to be perfect." I leaned back in the chair, my hands ice cold. Aria Bloom, A.B., not Alex Brown. And apparently, call A.B. wasn't a meeting. It was a date. I didn't feel anger anymore, only emptiness. Perhaps after so many years of endurance, pain had become so familiar that when it returned, all I wanted was to watch it no longer resist. But what truly woke me wasn't the emails. It was the final text exchange between him and Beatrice. "Victor, she'll sign it if we do it publicly. Trust me." Beatrice, "Good. Humiliation makes people obedient." I stared at those words for a long time. Humiliation makes people obedient. To break someone just to make them submit. A chill ran down my spine. In that moment, something inside me stirred, not hatred, but a sharp, cold clarity I had never felt before. I closed the laptop and looked around the apartment, object, every photo frame, every tiny crack in the wall. Everything seemed different. I no longer saw it as a cage, but as a battlefield. And if they wanted to go public, I would speak the truth. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window overlooking Lake Michigan that night. The Chicago sky was steel gray, the wind slapping against the glass, the waves hitting the shore like my own heartbeat. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew one thing for certain. From this moment on, I would never let anyone else decide my fate again. Sometimes betrayal doesn't come to destroy you. It comes to teach you that it's time to open your eyes. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The apartment was eerily quiet, with only the sound of wind from Lake Michigan slipping through the window cracks. Pale November sunlight spread across the dining table, where last night's wine glass still stood. I sat there for a long time, sipping cold coffee, trying to piece together the shards of truth that had just shattered. Victor, Beatrice, and a lawyer were planning a public humiliation. I knew they wouldn't stop. But if they calculated their every move, then so could I. I turned on his laptop and logged back into his account. In his email calendar, I found a thread between Victor and the attorney, Mercer Shaw. The details read, "Final version of the waiver document ready for signature during the event." Attached was a guest list with over 100 names. I recognized several. Old colleagues, mutual friends, and even his boss. They didn't just want to end our marriage. They wanted to strip me of dignity, to make me appear powerless in front of everyone. A cruel performance wrapped in fine wine and polite smiles. My heart was pounding, yet my mind felt sharply clear. No emotion, only cold focus. I saved every email, screenshotted each exchange, then forwarded them to my backup address. Then I plugged in a USB and copied everything. I knew that when truth is twisted, evidence becomes your only lifeline. The sound of the door startled me. Victor stepped in, gray coat, wearing that rehearsed cheerful face. He smiled. "I got you croissants from your favorite bakery." I looked at him, hiding a faint smirk. When people start offering gifts to cover guilt, it means betrayal has entered its second stage of justification. "Thank you," I replied softly. "Busy this morning?" "Meeting with the lawyer." "Oh, don't worry, nothing serious, just work stuff." "Lawyer." I heard every syllable like a needle piercing the air. After he left, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 3 years, Aisha. She was a college friend, now a divorce lawyer. When I told her briefly that I needed a private meeting, she paused for a few seconds, then said, "6 p.m. today. Don't bring anyone. And don't let them know." That evening, I went to her office in a glass building downtown Chicago. When she saw me, Aisha gripped my hand firmly, her eyes serious. "Tell me everything." I told her everything from the 3 a.m. phone call to the emails to Beatrice's questions about the apartment papers. She listened, took notes, then looked up and said bluntly, "Elena, they're setting a trap. Their goal is to get you to sign the waiver to forfeit property rights. Once you sign, that apartment becomes fully Victor's." I tightened my hold on the water glass as she continued, "But if the apartment was a premarital gift, the law protects you." "Do you have proof?" "Yes, my parents transferred the money directly, and I have the original contract." Aisha nodded, a sharp smile forming. "Good, then they've already lost half the game. Now one thing remains. You must stay calm. Don't let them know you know. When they build their stage for humiliation, you'll let them perform, then flip the table." I sat still, feeling the warmth of the glass in my hands. After years of enduring alone, it was the first time I felt I had an ally. I whispered, "Aisha, if they want it public, can I make it public too?" She smiled. "Of course. But to strike back, you need evidence and something they can't deny. Don't fight with tears, fight with truth." I left her office when it was already dark. The wind swept across Michigan Avenue, cutting against my skin, cold but awakening. I stopped by a copy shop near home, printed 3 sets of documents, the apartment contract, my parents' bank transfer, and copies of Victor's emails. I placed them neatly into a leather folder and locked it inside the safe. The room glowed faintly, the scent of lilies still lingering, but this time it didn't feel sad. It was a reminder. Everything can wither and also bloom again. Late that night, Victor came home, the expensive perfume clouding around him. He smiled, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "Do I seem different to you? Lately, I've been trying to start fresh to be a better man." I almost laughed. He thought I didn't know he was rehearsing his lines for the upcoming show. I only said softly, "You're right. Starting over is necessary." He missed the meaning. I turned to look at him, a faint smile he couldn't decipher. When he fell asleep, I stepped out to the balcony, gazing down at the stream of cars below. The streetlights shimmered on the lake like 1,000 fractured mirrors, broken, yet still reflecting light. I realized something. I didn't need to fight to keep a man. I only needed to stand firm to keep myself. That night, I wrote a short line in my notebook. November 8, I know everything, and I will not cry. They want to make me a victim. but I'll let them write their own sentence. The night wind was cold, but something inside me burned quietly, not anger but resolve. I'd spent 30 years beside him, long enough to understand how he calculated every move, but he forgot I was the one who used to balance every figure, review every line of every contract. I knew how far he would go, and I would go farther. I closed the window and looked around the apartment once more. Everything was still, like a thin layer of ice before it cracks. But this time, if it broke, I would be the one walking across, not the one sinking beneath. Sometimes you have to let others build their stages so that when the curtain rises, the world can see who the real lead actor is. On Thursday night, while he was watching the news, his phone lay face down on the table. A message flashed briefly across the screen before it went dark. Tomorrow, 5 p.m., confirmed. M.S. Mercer Shaw, the lawyer. The final meeting before the celebration. I calmly cleared the glasses and asked softly, "Are you busy tomorrow?" He smiled. "Just a small meeting, work stuff." "Why?" I looked straight at him. "Nothing. I just wanted to make sure you'd be home in time to go to the anniversary dinner with me." He nodded, confident. "Of course. Everything's ready." In my mind, those words sounded exactly like a confession. The next morning, I went to the bank. I had already planned to transfer all my personal savings into a separate account, opening another one at a different bank under my name only. The young teller handed me the forms and asked, "Would you like to transfer the full amount?" I smiled. "Yes. Let's call it a new beginning." On the way home, I stopped by a small office on Wabash. The place was old, but the man who owned it was someone I trusted. Perry, the real estate lawyer who had helped my parents buy the apartment years ago. He looked older but recognized me instantly. "Elena, it's been ages. Still on Lake Shore Drive?" "Yes," I said, taking a seat in his brown leather chair, surrounded by shelves of thick files. "But I need something urgent today." I told him everything, leaving nothing out. He listened carefully, his aged face sharp with thought. When I asked if the apartment truly belonged to me, he pulled out old folders, flipping through page after page. "Here," he said after a few minutes. "In 1994, the property was purchased entirely with your parents' funds. The title was initially in your name only. 2 months later, Victor's name was added, but as marital co-ownership, it cannot erase the original ownership of the recipient." I exhaled. "So, if we divorce, he can't claim half?" He nodded firmly. "Exactly. In a dispute, the court will consider the source of the funds. This apartment is your premarital property. But don't let them know you have a copy of these records until they make their move." I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. "Mr. Perry," I said, "please make certified copies and keep one for backup." He studied me. "What are you planning to do?" I answered quietly. "Not revenge. I just want them to understand that some mistakes must be paid for with dignity." When I left his office, a thin snowfall began. I looked up at the gray sky and wondered whether it was a sign of ending or beginning. That evening, Victor came home early. He walked in holding a bouquet of white roses, one flower I never liked, though he always insisted it was pure and elegant. I took it, placed it in a vase, and asked, "Tomorrow's the anniversary." "Are you nervous?" He chuckled, taking off his coat. "Nervous? Not at all. I just hope everything goes according to plan." Plan? I turned away to hide my faint smile. If only he knew my real plan, he wouldn't sleep tonight. When he went to shower, I opened the drawer. I took out the prepared documents, the apartment deed, the new bank account information, and the certificate Mr. Perry had just signed confirming my ownership. I placed them into an ivory envelope and slipped it into the small handbag I planned to carry tomorrow night. At the bottom, I added the printed invitation that read, "Mr. and Mrs. Langford, table number 1. I stared at those words, amused. "Table number 1, I whispered, "the place where your act will end." That night, I didn't sleep. I stood on the balcony, looking down at the fading lights along the lake. The wind carried echoes of all the moments I had once believed in the early days of love, the hand holding in the rain, the dreams we never finished. but now they were just remnants of a performance. I felt no anger, only calm, like someone about to end a song that had gone on too long. Near midnight, he took another phone call. I heard him whisper in the hallway, "Everything's fine. She suspects nothing. Mother, Hayes will be there. After the speech, she just needs to sign." Mother, Beatrice. Hay, S, their lawyer. I stood in the dark, gripping the railing until my fingertips turned white. When he came back to the bedroom, I was already lying still with my eyes closed. He kissed my forehead and murmured, "Sleep well. Tomorrow will be a special day." I almost laughed but remained silent. "Yes, Victor, tomorrow will be special, just not in the way you think." At dawn, I woke before sunrise. I brewed coffee, opened the window, and took a deep breath. My chest felt lighter than ever. I chose a long black velvet dress, silver heels, and the pearl earrings my father once gave me. Every item I wore that day had meaning, not to impress anyone, but to remind myself that I was still Elena Langford, the woman who was taught that dignity is never for sale. When Victor stepped out of the dressing room, adjusting his tie before the mirror, he glanced at me and paused. "You look different today." I smiled softly. "Different is good, isn't it?" He nodded, unaware of what I meant. Before leaving the house, I placed a small note on the table. It had only one sentence: "Be careful what you wish for, Victor, because sometimes it comes true, but not the way you want." Then I walked out quietly, feeling certain that the storm they had prepared for me would soon sweep them away instead. Because the truth is, once a woman has been betrayed deeply enough, she stops trying to hold on. She starts calculating. The ballroom was on the top floor of the Waterford Hotel, overlooking Lake Michigan, glittering with city lights. Everything was meticulously arranged: white tablecloths, ivory roses, crystal glasses gleaming under candlelight. The cello played a soft rendition of Moon River, elegant and perfect to the point of feeling artificial. I walked in, holding a small handbag that contained all my documents, feeling as though I was stepping onto a stage designed to humiliate, except they didn't know the script had changed. "Mrs. Langford, over here," one of Victor's colleagues called, raising his glass. I nodded, smiled slightly, letting my eyes sweep the room. Over 100 guests, friends, business partners, relatives. Everyone was laughing, unaware that beneath the glitter was a cruel performance. At the center table, Beatrice sat upright in a dark blue velvet gown, a champagne flute in hand, her eyes sharp as blades. Beside her was Victor, in perfectly fitted, hair slicked, smile radiant. He saw me, came forward, and said smoothly, "You're here. You look stunning." I replied evenly, "Thank you, Victor. Tonight will certainly be memorable." The dinner began. Toasts and laughter filled the room. Victor always knew how to play the role of the perfect husband. He raised his glass, smiling, speaking about 25 years with this wonderful woman, drawing polite applause from the crowd. I sat still, listening, feeling each of his words tighten the noose he was unknowingly placing around his own neck. After a while, I noticed a gray-haired man in a black suit at the back table, speaking quietly with Beatrice. I knew immediately it was Mercer Shaw, the lawyer. In another corner, a young woman with platinum blonde hair, beautiful and poised, Aria Bloom. She was AB from the meeting schedule. Aria looked at Victor with unhidden desire, possession, and triumph. I smiled faintly, so their little play even had an audience. Glasses clinked. Victor stood up, took the microphone, and signaled the music to stop. The room fell silent. I saw Beatrice place a hand on his shoulder as if to say, "Your moment has come." "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor began, his voice deep and confident, "today is a special day. 25 years of marriage is a long journey, full of memories and challenges, but life, as we all know, is about change." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the guests before landing on me. Sometimes, to be honest with ourselves, we must have the courage to admit it's time to close a chapter. A ripple of whispers spread across the room. I sat still, meeting his eyes. In them, I saw the arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. "In these 25 years," he continued, Elena and I have shared much, but we've also realized we are two very different people. She seeks peace and quiet, and he smiled, lowering his head slightly, I seek change. The room seemed to hold its breath. Beatrice pressed her lips together while Arya looked on proudly. Victor's tone hardened. Therefore, I'd like to announce that today will be our last day as husband and wife. Gasps echoed through the hall. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." He held up a document. This is the legal paperwork to transfer ownership of the apartment. Everything has been prepared. Elena just needs to sign, and everything will remain amicable. No lawsuits, no disputes, just a civilized ending. Beatrice stood, beaming. We hope everyone will support this mature decision. I looked at them, then smiled. The room went silent. I rose, walked slowly toward Victor, and held out my hand for the microphone. Thank you, Victor, I said softly, my voice so calm that people leaned forward to hear. Thank you for your late honesty, but perhaps tonight you forgot one thing. You also have something to say. Victor frowned. Elena, this isn't the time. I cut him off. On the contrary, this is exactly the time. I turned to the guests. Ladies and gentlemen, you may have believed this evening was a celebration of a beautiful marriage. In truth, as he said, it's the funeral of a betrayal. A louder murmur swept the room. I continued, steady. Victor here, along with his mother Mrs. Beatrice and the attorney Mr. Mercer Shaw, seated right there, have been planning to strip me of ownership of our apartment. A property my parents gifted me before the marriage, which they wanted me to relinquish through a legal waiver. I know everything from the emails, the phone calls, even the dinner meeting last week. Victor's face went pale. Elena, stop this nonsense. I opened my bag, pulled out an envelope, and held it high. This is the original real estate contract signed in 1994. The purchase was made entirely with funds from my parents, not from you. And here is the notarized statement from the lawyer who handled the transaction. The apartment is legally mine and protected by law. Mercer Shaw tried to slip toward the exit, but several guests blocked his way. A man stood up, his voice low with anger. Victor, were you really trying to cheat your wife? Beatrice shot up. Elena, you're disgracing the family. I smiled at her. No, Mother, I'm simply restoring the truth. I took out a second paper, the light reflecting off it. And here is the inheritance document I received 3 weeks ago from my Aunt Charlotte in Germany. A flat in Munich, a property in Miami Beach, and a bank account worth over $1 million. You once said I'd leave with nothing. Apparently your math was off. The room fell completely silent. Arya froze, face drained of color. Victor's mouth hung open, speechless. I stepped closer to him and said quietly, though the microphone caught every word, You wanted to humiliate me in front of 100 people. Instead, you just unmasked yourself. I turned back to the guests. Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry you had to witness this. But sometimes, emotional justice must be public. For 25 years, I stayed silent. Tonight, I just want to say I don't hate anyone. I just don't want anyone else to go through what I did. I set the microphone down, my smile gentle but resolute. Behind me, voices erupted. A woman shouted, You're pathetic, Victor. A man shook his head. Shame on you. Arya tried to leave, but guests stopped her, demanding answers. Mercer was gone. Beatrice trembled, trying to pull her son back into his seat. I walked out of the ballroom, opened the door, and inhaled the cold air of the hallway. The light reflected off my shoulders, a soft but bright signal of freedom. Behind me, the noise grew louder. Victor was trying to explain. Beatrice was crying, and the crowd was recording with their phones. I didn't look back. I only thought, in the end, justice doesn't need swords. It only needs truth and the courage to speak it. Stepping out into the lobby, I caught my reflection in the glass door. Calm, light, a woman unafraid, and in that very moment I knew the game he started was over, but my life had only just begun. I left the hotel just after 9 o'clock. The cold wind swept across Michigan Avenue, biting my skin, but I felt as light as someone who had just walked out of an invisible prison. Through the glass doors, I could still see them inside. Victor standing in the middle of the ballroom, his face pale, mouth open like a man stripped of speech. Beatrice sat collapsed on a chair, her hands trembling, while Arya sobbed uncontrollably, her high-pitched cries tangled with the chaos of the crowd. The sound of phone cameras filled the room, flashes bursting as they captured every expression. I knew that within hours the story would be everywhere, and Victor would become the talk of the city. I didn't feel joy, only a strange stillness, like standing in the eye of a storm where all sound is swallowed and only your heartbeat remains. The taxi driver, an older man, glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "Cold night, huh, ma'am?" I smiled faintly, my voice hoarse but calm. "Yes, but sometimes the cold is good. It wakes people up." As the cab turned onto Lakeshore Drive, I looked up at the city behind me. Chicago still glittered, still noisy, but to me, it felt like a chapter closing. Inside my bag, the envelope of documents rested quietly, shielded, and my declaration that I was no longer the victim. The next morning, the news had spread everywhere. A former colleague sent me a video from the party. In it, Victor stood in the middle of the room, forcing a smile, trying to explain himself as voices shouted over him. "He's destroyed his own career," the attached message read. I didn't reply. I didn't need confirmation. I just brewed coffee, opened the window, and let the cold air in. By noon, Beatrice called. Her name appeared on the screen. I hesitated a second before answering. "Elena," her voice rasped. "Can you come see me? We need to talk." I took a slow breath. "I think we've said everything, Mother." "No, you don't understand," she choked out. "Everything's gone. Victor lost his job. Reporters are hounding us. And my house. I mortgaged it to pay Hayes. He's disappeared. I have nothing left." I stayed silent for a few seconds, then said evenly, "I'm sorry, but that's the price of complicity. I don't hate you, but I can't save you either." She wept softly, the sound delicate and fragile, like breaking glass. I listened quietly, then ended the call. That afternoon, I met Aisha at the courthouse. She placed a stack of divorce papers in front of me, expedited due to the public scandal. "It'll all be finalized soon," she said. "He won't get anything except the old cabin and the Lexus." I nodded, looking at the cold black letters on the page, and felt an unexpected calm. "Thank you, Aisha. Without you," she smiled, squeezing my hand. "Without you being strong enough to stand up, I couldn't have done anything. You know, everyone at the courthouse was talking about you today." Someone said, "That woman didn't seek revenge, just reclaimed the truth." I think they were right. A week later, Victor sent me a short email, only 2 sentences. "Elena, I'm sorry. I've lost everything. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I was wrong." I didn't reply. Forgiveness doesn't exist in words. It lives in silence. 3 months passed. I moved into a new apartment in Miami Beach, where sunlight poured through the glass windows every morning. I spent hours reading, writing my memories, and planting flowers on the balcony. Each morning, I brewed coffee, listening to the waves against the shore below, feeling as if a new chapter of my life had quietly begun. I sold the cabin in Wisconsin and transferred all the proceeds to a small foundation I created, Aurora Foundation, helping middle-aged women betrayed or abandoned by their husbands find a new beginning. When I signed the registration papers, the clerk asked, "What does Aurora mean?" I smiled gently. "It means dawn, because for us, dawn doesn't depend on age." One afternoon, I received a message from Candace. She sent me a picture from social media, Victor driving for a rideshare company. In the photo, he wore sunglasses, his face weary. She added, "He's living with his mother now, in a small rental outside the city. Everyone feels sorry for you." I replied, "Don't. I'm fine. Everything is where it belongs." That evening, I sat on the balcony, watching the Miami skyline glow. I thought of the night at the Waterford. Look in his eyes, Beatrice's cold smile, the noise, the moment I spoke the truth. Back then, I thought I was breaking. But now, I realize that moment was when I was reborn. I wrote a few lines in my journal, as if speaking to myself. Some endings aren't tragedies, they're release. Some losses don't break. They remind us that we still have the power to choose how to live. My phone rang. It was Aisha, her voice bright with excitement. "Elena, you should see this video from that night that is going viral. Everyone's calling you a symbol of dignity. One outlet even named it the Silver Night of Justice." I laughed. Emotional justice, right? Exactly. And this time it belongs to you. I closed the phone, shut my eyes, and drew in the salty breeze. Under the moonlight, the ocean shimmered peacefully, as if no storm had ever existed. I understood then that life doesn't have to end in revenge. Sometimes simply standing tall, speaking the truth, and walking away with dignity is the victory. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no fear. Only one quiet thought echoed in my mind. At last, I have become myself again. Spring arrived slowly, soft as a morning breath. I woke up in my small apartment in Miami Beach, where the first rays of sunlight slipped through the white curtains and painted the walls with gentle silken light. The scent of coffee filled the kitchen, blending with the faint salt of the ocean breeze. It had been over 3 months since the night at Waterford Night of Justice, and since then, I had never slept so deeply. I started a new habit. Each morning, I brewed an espresso, opened the balcony, and wrote a few lines in a brown leather notebook I called the Second Life Journal. In it, I recorded small things. The smell of last night's rain, the sunlight on rooftops, a flower growing through the cracks of the walkway. I no longer wrote to remember, but to give thanks, to thank myself for not collapsing. In the afternoons, I stopped by the small office of the Aurora Foundation. On the glass door, silver letters shimmered under the sunlight. "It's never too late to begin again." Inside, a few women sat around a round table, women who, like me, had once fallen, but were now learning to begin again. They came to rewrite resumes, submit job applications, or simply sit together in silence. Some had divorced, some had lost their husbands, some just wanted to leave a house where laughter no longer lived. I saw pieces of myself in each of their eyes. One afternoon, a woman named Mariana, 62, fresh from a 40 marriage, asked me, "How do you know when you've truly forgiven?" I looked at her and smiled. "When you can look back at the past without trembling and say, 'Thank you, because through it I found myself again.'" She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, but they were tears of relief. Late that day, a courier delivered an envelope from Chicago. Inside was a handwritten letter, the script stiff and shaky. "Elena, I don't expect forgiveness, but I know what you did was right. Perhaps I taught you patience, but you taught me dignity." Signed, Beatrice. I folded the letter and placed it beside an old photograph, one from my wedding day with Victor. 25 years condensed into a single wooden frame, silent. I didn't burn it, didn't tear it. I just left it there, a reminder that every wound, given enough time, becomes a scar no longer painful, only proof that you once lived. That evening I walked to the beach, where waves brushed the sand in gentle succession. A group of young tourists was lighting a bonfire, their laughter echoing, the smell of burning wood mingling with the breeze. I sat down, slipped off my heels, and let my bare feet sink into the cool sand. Inside me there was no anger, no regret, but only a clear, quiet peace. I thought of all the years I had lived to please others, waking early to cook, cleaning, hiding pain. Now, I live for myself. I no longer feared age, loneliness, or pity. At 62, I felt like someone newly born, not for anyone, not to prove anything, but simply to exist entirely. That night, when I returned home, I played Miles Davis's Blue and Green, the same song I had heard on that fateful night. But this time the melody didn't ache. It was just a beautiful tune, tasting of salt and smoke, like life itself, bitter, briny, yet tender when you learn to listen. I looked out the window, where the moonlight shimmered on the sea, and in that moment I realized peace is not the reward after justice, it is justice itself. I opened my notebook and wrote the final lines of the day. "If one day you must walk through darkness, don't be afraid. Because darkness isn't the end, it's where light learns how to find its way back." I smiled softly, closed the notebook, and whispered, not for anyone to hear, only for myself, "All right, Elena. The game is over. Now comes life." And before going to bed, I added a small note at the bottom of the page, a message to the women listening to this story. Have you ever stood back up after everything fell apart? Tell me where you are beginning again. And don't forget to subscribe to hear the next chapters of Begin Again stories. 3 months later, the Aurora Foundation had become something real, not just a small office, but a home for women who once had their wings broken. I rented another ground floor space by Biscayne Bay, opening weekend workshops on skill training and emotional healing. I never imagined that at 62, I would become someone guiding other women to rediscover themselves. But truthfully, I wasn't a teacher who simply told stories, my story. And somehow, through it, they saw themselves. Once, a woman 20 years younger than me named Clara asked, "Do you ever wish you had found out sooner, so you wouldn't have lost everything?" I looked at her and replied, "No. If I had found out sooner, I wouldn't have heard enough to awaken. And maybe I'd still be there, in that house, waiting for someone else to permit me to live." She cried. I didn't comfort her. I just sat quietly, because sometimes silence is how we allow others to heal. At the end of May, a local TV station invited me to speak on their program, Women Who Rebuilt Their Lives. I sat in front of the camera, bright lights shining, but I didn't feel afraid. The interviewer asked, "Do you believe emotional justice is real?" I smiled and answered slowly, "Emotional justice doesn't come from watching others pay the price. It comes when you no longer need them to." The room fell silent. I saw the faces of the crew behind the cameras nodding, others wiping their eyes. That night, when the show aired, hundreds of messages flooded the Aurora Foundation inbox. Some wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to file for divorce after 20 years of being disrespected." Others said simply, "I started walking every morning because you said, 'Begin again with the smallest thing.'" I read each line, not out of pride, but because I felt humbled to be a part of their healing journeys. One morning, I stepped out onto my balcony, opened my laptop, and saw an email from a familiar address, Victor, Langford, @I. Hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside were a few lines. "Elena, I'm in alcohol recovery treatment. I know I destroyed everything. Mother passed away 2 weeks ago. I don't expect you to come back, but I hope you'll attend the funeral. I have no one else." I stared at the screen for a long time. No anger, no pity. Only the quiet sense that time had done its softening, everything, even the wounds. I didn't respond immediately. That afternoon, I went to the beach and stood watching the waves. A small child ran past, fell, then got up, brushed off the sand and laughed. The sight made me smile. I understood then that forgiveness is not an obligation but freedom. 3 days later, I flew to Chicago. The funeral was small, with only a handful of people. When I walked in, Victor stood beside his mother's casket, thinner, hair graying, eyes weary. He looked at me but said nothing. I placed a bouquet of white lilies by the casket, bowed my head and whispered, "Rest now, Beatrice. I hope you find the peace you once refused." Then I turned to leave. Victor tried to speak, but I shook my head. "There's no need," I said softly. "Sometimes, silence is the final forgiveness." Back in Miami, I felt different. No more ties were binding me. I celebrated alone by buying a pot of lavender and setting it by the window. Its scent reminded me of mornings in Charleston when I was young, when everything was pure and I hadn't yet known betrayal. I realized that memories don't always have to be burdens if you learn how to turn them into anchors. One evening, Aisha called on video. "Elena," she said, "someone just donated to your foundation." I asked who, and she replied, "Anonymous. But the note says, 'For the women who found the light again.'" I was silent. I didn't need to guess. I simply said, "Accept it." Because sometimes, remorse can grow into something good. That night, I sat alone on the balcony, listening to the waves and watching the distant lights reflected on the water. I wrote in my journal, "Justice doesn't always happen in a courtroom. Sometimes it happens in a kitchen, when a woman stands up, pours herself a cup of tea, and says, 'I deserve peace.'" I closed the journal, leaned back in the chair, and closed my eyes. Across the ocean, perhaps Victor too was learning how to begin again, even if late. And here, among the waves, I no longer needed to know how his story would end, because in the end, what matters isn't who pays the price, but who chooses to keep living. I smiled, whispering to myself, "Thank you, life, for giving me a second chance, and thank you for not wasting it." 1 year after the television interview, Miami shimmered under the first sunlight of summer. The city seemed to move with the steady rhythm of waves against the sand, the laughter of tourists blending with the music from cafes along the street. I sat on the balcony of my sixth-floor apartment, overlooking the ocean. Beside me was a steaming cup of herbal tea and a thick Second Life journal, now almost complete. I had written in it every day for 365 days, each page marking a small milestone in my rebirth. Below the building, the women of the Aurora Foundation were setting up for their first official conference. They called it the Morning After, a gathering for women who had just stepped out of painful marriages. I could hear their laughter, the scraping of chairs, the sound checks for microphones inside me rose a quiet sense of gratitude. Everything that once broke me had somehow become the thing that helped others rise. Aisha arrived early, carrying a bouquet of purple lavender. "For you," she said, setting it on the table. "I still remember what you told me that first day. The dawn always comes. We just have to open our eyes at the right time." I smiled. "And you helped me open mine sooner, Aisha." When the conference began, I sat in the last row. On stage, Marianith, a woman who had once asked me about forgiveness, was telling her story. Her voice trembled but was strong. "I used to think 60 was the end of everything, but it turned out to be just a comma. Because that was when I learned the most important thing, that loving yourself isn't selfish survival." The room erupted in applause. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry. After the conference, a young woman approached me, around 30, and said softly, "I watched your video last week. I finally left my abusive husband. I just wanted to say, thank you." I took her hand and looked into her eyes. "Don't thank me. Just remember this. From now on, your life is yours, and no one gets to write it for you." That afternoon, after everyone left, I stayed behind to clear the tables. The golden sunlight poured through the glass doors, reflecting across the glowing sea. I looked out and saw small boats cutting through the water, leaving white trails that slowly faded. Suddenly, I remembered something my father once told me. "When you're lost at sea, don't panic. Look for the horizon. It's always there, no matter which way you turn." My phone rang, a number from Chicago. A middle-aged man's voice came through. "Hello, I'm the attorney for Mr. Victor Langford. He passed away last week in a car accident. Before he died, he left a letter for you." I was silent for a few seconds before replying, "Please send it to my foundation's office. I'll read it when I'm ready." 3 days later, the letter arrived. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside were a few shaky lines. "Elena, I know I don't deserve it, but because of you, I finally understood what dignity means. Thank you for not destroying me, even when I destroyed you. If there's another life, I hope I meet you again. Not to love you, but to apologize sooner." I folded the letter and didn't cry. My heart felt as calm as the sea after a storm. Forgiveness, in the end, was something he received not from me, but from time itself. That night, I carried the lavender bouquet to the balcony and released the stems into the sea. Their scent drifted on the wind, light and lingering. I watched the dark water shimmer with moonlight, thinking of the pain, the betrayal, the sleepless nights, and the days when I thought I'd never rise again. Now, they were only memories, longer threats, only reminders. I opened my journal and wrote the final line. When we dare to look at ourselves without fear, that's when we are truly free. Then I closed it, placed it beside the cooled cup of tea, and gazed at the glowing horizon. I smiled and said softly, as if to life itself, "Thank you for letting me live long enough to learn that sometimes justice isn't about making someone fall. It's about learning to stand and walk away without looking back." Have you ever experienced a moment like that when you finally woke up? Tell me, where did your new beginning start? And don't forget to subscribe to watch the following chapters of Begin Again Stories. After the event, legacy and continuation. One July morning, before the sun grew harsh, I arrived at the Aurora Foundation office earlier than usual. The small room was bathed in soft golden light, filled with the gentle mix of coffee and lavender, like a slow melody. On the wall, picture frames lined up neatly, faces of more than 60 women who had once come here, each one a story of rebirth. I called that row of portraits the Wall of Strength, the Wall of Resilience. As I touched each frame, I remembered the beginning, just me, Aisha, and the first 3 women brave enough to walk through that door. Now, Aurora had 8 small branches across Florida and even hosted online discussions for women from afar. Each week, I received hundreds of letters, sometimes just a few hurried lines, "Thank you. Because of your story, I found the courage to leave." I read them all, keeping the ones written with trembling hands in a wooden box on my desk. Today, I was expecting a special visitor, Grace, my niece, the daughter of my late younger brother. She was 27, recently out of an 8-year relationship. "I want to learn about Aurora," she wrote in her email. When she arrived, she hugged me tightly, her hair carrying a hint of sweet orange. "Auntie, I'm afraid I'll end up like you once, trusting the wrong person." I held her hand, my gaze gentle but steady. "If you've already realized that, you're stronger than I ever was." We sat together all morning by the window overlooking the bay. I told her about that night at Waterford shock, the fear, and the moment I said, "All right, the game is over." Grace listened silently, her eyes glimmering. When I reached the part about Victor's final letter, she whispered, "Did you truly forgive him?" I smiled. "It's not about forgiving or not forgiving. When you no longer wish to hurt anyone, that's when you know you're free." That afternoon, Grace helped me photograph the office for the Foundation's new website. When the camera clicked, a strange wave of emotion rose within me. The image in the lens portrait was no longer Elena Langford, the betrayed wife from long ago. It was someone else, a woman who had walked through fire and now carried the flame to light the way for others. After Grace left, I stayed alone, the sunset pouring through the glass window. I took out the Second Life journal and turned to the last page. Among the faded ink lines, I pasted a new photo taken today, Grace and me, hand in hand, smiling. Beneath it, I wrote, "The next generation will not have to endure what we did if we are brave enough to speak." Outside, the waves beat softly. I closed the notebook, inhaling deeply, feeling an unfamiliar peace. I no longer needed the past to return anything to me, nor to prove that I had been right. I only wanted to keep telling real stories, for the women who believed their time was over, to remind them that no one's time ever ends. It simply hasn't come yet for them to shine. Before leaving the office, I stopped before the wall of portraits. I took one more frame and placed it in the center of the photo of Grace and me taken today. Beneath it, I fixed a small brass plaque. "For the women who dared to begin again." The evening light reflected off the glass, sparkling like threads of gold. I smiled, gently touching the words "begin again," and felt my heart beat in a calm, steady rhythm. Because sometimes, the greatest legacy isn't what we leave behind, but the lives we help to begin again. 1 year after placing the final photograph on the Wall of Strength, spring returned to Miami. The sky was clear blue, and sunlight spread across Biscayne Bay like a sheet of silver silk. I sat on the balcony of my small apartment, once a refuge after the storm, now a home of peace. On the table, the lavender plant was in full bloom, its scent soft and deep. Beside it was a cup of herbal tea and the Second Life journal, now closed, not because I had nothing left to write, but because I was finally living the story I had written. I heard the waves below, the distant cry of seagulls, and wondered if somewhere out there, someone my age had just lost something and thought their life was over. I wanted to tell them, "It's not. You're simply between 2 chapters, and the next one is waiting for you to turn the page." In the afternoon, I stopped by the main office of the Aurora Foundation. The meeting room was filled with light, the walls adorned with new photographs of women from everywhere: Atlanta, Houston, Seattle, even Toronto. They were proof that the small flame once lit had become a spreading light. Aisha approached, smiling. Elena, the foundation has just been chosen to partner with an international organization for women's recovery after divorce. They're calling the project The Second Sunrise. I laughed, tears welling up uncontrollably. Another sunrise, I said. Good, because sunrise never comes just once. We walked out onto the balcony overlooking the bay. A group of young women was doing yoga below, soft music playing in the air. One of them looked up, recognized me, and waved. "Mrs. Elena, you inspired us," I smiled back, pointing toward the sea. "Not me, you found yourselves." When everyone left, I stayed behind, sitting by the window, watching the sunset fade. In that quiet moment, I realized life had never really taken anything from me. It had only asked me to see it differently. Loss had emptied me, but it also made room for light to enter. I opened my phone and saw a message from Grace. "Auntie, I just got hired as a counselor at the new Aurora branch. Thank you for believing in me." I smiled, pride swelling in my heart. The journey had come full circle from a betrayed woman. I had become someone who passed hope to the next generation. And now, they would carry it forward as I stepped back. Before leaving the office, I wrote a small note and taped it to the glass door. "If you walk in here today with a broken heart, remember you don't need to be perfect to begin again. You only need enough courage to walk through this door." I stepped outside, the evening sunlight wrapping around my face. The sea shimmered, the breeze carried the scent of lavender and salt. I spoke softly, part greeting, part message for those still lost. No one is ever too late to begin again. No one is ever too old to be happy. And no one is ever truly lost, as long as they choose to keep moving. Then I went home, opened the door, turned off the lights, and let the natural light fill the room. I stood by the window, gazing toward the radiant horizon. Begin Again Stories. Those 3 words appeared in my mind, no longer as a project title, but as a prayer for life itself. I closed my eyes and smiled. My life no longer revolved around who once betrayed me, but around whom I had forgiven, more importantly, that I had chosen to love myself again. Have you ever felt like you were beginning again, at an age when others said it was too late? Tell me where you are standing now and how you are finding your sunrise again. And if this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to hear more journeys of rebirth only on Begin Again Stories.